when Paige Callahan started digging a small room beneath the old horse barn at the edge of Alder Creek, the whole town called it the sleeping place of a woman who had lost her mind. Dean Mercer said the smell of horse manure would kill her before winter did. Warren Pike laughed that only a desperate woman would crawl under the hooves of horses just to escape the cold. But Paige was not building a room of shame. She was building a shelter that knew how to use the warmth of the earth, dry straw, heated stones, and the body heat of animals to keep a person alive. And when the blizzard finally locked the whole valley in ice, that mocked little room became the only place still breathing. If you think a room beneath a horse barn sounds like madness, wait until you hear what happened when the snow sealed every door in town. Alder Creek sat in Wyoming Territory in the late 1880s, a narrow valley pressed between two mountain ranges where summer was beautiful, but winter could turn into a trap that killed. Cold wind rolled down from the northern gap in the mountains almost every year, slamming straight into the houses built on open, unprotected ground. The people who had lived there the longest knew the wind by its sound before they ever felt it, a low howl that came down off the ridge like something hunting. Paige Callahan lived at the edge of that valley, in the old cabin that had belonged to her father. Her father, Ellis Callahan, had once kept the stagecoach station and the horse barn along the mountain route, a man who understood weather the way other men understood scripture. He died at the end of autumn, leaving Paige an aging barn, 2 old horses, a handful of tools, a few sacks of straw, and a notebook filled with the winters he had survived. Nobody in Alder Creek expected her to make it through the season alone, least of all the men who had known her father. After the funeral, the townspeople offered their condolences, but no one truly helped her. Warren Pike wanted to buy Paige's land cheap because it sat close to the creek, and when she refused to sell, he began calling her the girl who kept a dead man's barn. He said it in the store, at the tavern, wherever men gathered to talk about who was winning and who was losing in Alder Creek that year. The names stuck the way cruel names always do in small towns, spreading faster than the truth ever could. Paige went to Cole Brantley's store to buy lumber, nails, small panes of glass, and tar paper to seal the gaps in her cabin walls. Cole turned her away. He told her that winter was coming fast, that supplies were scarce, and that he could not extend more credit to a woman with no large herd of cattle to her name. He did not say it unkindly, but he did not say it gently either. And Paige understood that kindness in Alder Creek came with conditions she could no longer meet. Dean Mercer came by to look at her cabin and concluded, without much thought, that it would never survive the winter. In his judgment, the north wall was too thin, the roof too low, the windows already cracked, the chimney old and unreliable. He told her plainly that she should either sell the land to Warren or prepare to freeze. Paige listened to him the way she listened to most of the men in town now, with a quiet patience that had nothing to do with agreement. But Paige did not look at the old barn the way Dean and Warren did, as a pile of rotting wood good for nothing. She saw it as the only place left with straw, packed earth, animal warmth, and a floor low enough to escape the worst of the wind. Where they saw failure, she saw the last resource she had, and she did not intend to waste it. That single difference in how she looked at the same wooden building would decide before the winter ended? Who in Alder Creek understood survival and who only understood comfort? At night, alone in the cabin her father had built with his own hands, Paige often thought about how quickly people had turned away once there was no longer a man's voice attached to her name. When Ellis Callahan was alive, the same neighbors who now mocked her had tipped their hats to him on the road and traded him tools without a second thought. She was not foolish enough to believe their coldness was only about money or land. Part of it, she understood, was that a woman alone unsettled them, a reminder that survival in that valley did not actually require a husband, a large herd, or a name men respected. She carried that quiet unfairness the way she carried firewood, without complaint, because complaining changed nothing about the coming cold. The first night after Cole refused her, Paige slept in the cold cabin, with the wind pushing through the gaps in the wood, making the fire in the stove shudder in uneven bursts. She woke near dawn to find a thin layer of ice had formed over the water in her tin cup. It was early in the season still, and already the cold was finding its way into places she had thought were sealed. She sat by the dying fire for a long while before she reached for the one thing her father had left her that no one could take away. She opened her father's notebook. Inside there were no soft words of comfort, only rough, practical notes on survival, the direction of the wind, the depth of the ice, how to keep straw dry, how to dig a room beneath a horse barn to escape the wind and use the warmth rising from the earth. Ellis Callahan had never been a man for sentiment, and his handwriting reflected that, cramped and efficient, as though every word had been rationed like firewood. One line in the notebook made Paige stop and read it twice. If the wind takes the fire above the ground, he had written, go down to where the wind cannot breathe. Her father had once told her that many travelers survived storms by sleeping in a low chamber beneath a barn, where the earth held heat and the horses above made the air a little less cold. It was not clean, and it was not beautiful, but it kept people alive, and that was the only measure her father had ever cared about. Paige checked the floor of the barn the next morning. Beneath the old boards there was a patch of packed earth sitting lower than the rest, and when she cleared away the dust, she found that her father had already begun digging a small chamber there, one he never finished. She realized, with a feeling she could not fully name, that he had been preparing for a winter he did not live long enough to face. The unfinished hole in the ground felt less like an accident and more like an inheritance. She decided to turn that unfinished space into a hidden room, low to the ground, sealed against drafts, with a raised straw bed, heated stones for warmth, small vents for air, and a trapdoor hidden beneath a layer of loose straw. It was not a plan born of desperation alone, but of a stubborn belief that her father's notes were worth more than any comfort Warren Pike's money could buy. If anyone in town had asked her that week what she was building, she would not have had an easy answer. Only the certainty that she was finishing something her father started. Paige began digging during the day and covering her work at night, but hiding it did not last long in a town where everyone watched everyone else. Dean Mercer came by to remeasure the barn wall at Warren Pike's request, and he saw the freshly turned earth, the loosened floorboards, and the river stones stacked neatly to one side. He did not need an explanation to draw his own conclusions, and his conclusions were not kind. He laughed and asked Paige if she planned to bury herself beneath the horses. By the next morning, the whole town knew, and Dean had already given the room a name that would follow Paige for months. He called it the Stable Grave, and the name spread through Alder Creek faster than any warning about the weather ever could. Warren Pike turned it into a joke at the tavern, telling anyone who would listen that Paige was poor enough that she no longer knew the difference between a bed and a hole in the ground. Cole Brantley told her, with a smile that was not entirely unkind but not kind either, that if she wanted to live beneath a horse barn, he could at least sell her a shovel instead of lumber. A few people walking past the barn slowed down just to peer inside, curious the way people are curious about accidents. Someone left a small bundle of dried flowers near the barn door, as though visiting a grave, and someone else remarked that the smell of manure would suffocate her long before the snow ever could. Paige heard all of it and said nothing in her own defense. She understood that if she tried to explain how the earth held heat, how cold air sinks, how dry straw insulates and heated stone radiates warmth slowly through the night, they would laugh anyway. People who lived in large, warm houses rarely wanted to learn survival from someone who had been forced to live by small, careful tricks. Their comfort had made them deaf to anything that sounded like desperation, even when desperation was the only honest teacher left in the valley. Naomi Vale was the only person in Alder Creek who did not mock her. She ran the small eating house near the center of town and had known Paige since they were girls, long before either of them understood what winter in that valley could take from a person. Naomi asked if Paige needed extra burlap sacks, and Paige accepted them gratefully. "I am not building this room for the cold nights," Paige told her quietly. "I am building it for the night when every door in this valley stops opening." That single sentence would echo through the rest of the winter, though neither woman knew it yet. Naomi did not fully understand what Paige meant, but something in the way she said it made Naomi start paying closer attention to her own preparations, quietly, without telling anyone why. It was a small act of trust between two women in a town that had shown Paige very little of either trust or kindness, and it would matter more than anyone in Alder Creek could have guessed that autumn. Even the children in Alder Creek had picked up the joke by then, daring one another to run past the barn after dark and knock on its wall before running away laughing. Paige heard their small footsteps some nights, and their muffled giggling drifting through the cracks in the wood, and she never chased them off. She remembered being a child in that same valley once, following whatever story adults were telling that season without asking whether it was true. She simply kept working, kept mixing clay and ash in the lantern light. Long after the children had gone home to warm suppers, she no longer had the means to prepare for herself. Paige did not dig a careless hole to sleep in. She built a low room beneath the barn floor, tall enough only to sit upright, with walls packed from clay soil mixed with wood ash, chopped straw, and a little shed horsehair to help everything bind together. This mixture reduced moisture and held heat far better than bare earth ever could, a fact her father's notebook confirmed in 3 separate entries written years apart. Stirred the mixture on a small patch first, patient in a way that surprised even her, before committing to the walls of the entire room. The floor of the room was raised on old boards resting across flat stones, so that whoever slept there would never lie directly against the frozen ground. Beneath the bed she packed dry straw inside cloth sacks, and beside the bed she carved a small stone alcove meant to hold rocks that had been heated over the stove before a storm arrived. Every choice she made came directly from her father's handwriting, tested against her own common sense, refined by trial rather than blind faith. She trusted the notebook, but she trusted her own hands more. She built 2 very small air vents. One drew air from the sheltered side of the barn, passing through a short wooden pipe and a filtering layer of straw before reaching the room below. The other released air higher up, venting toward the roof line of the barn, and both vents had sliding wooden covers to prevent the wind from forcing its way backward into the chamber. These 2 small openings would decide, more than anything else she built, whether the room below would sustain a living person or slowly suffocate one. The entrance was a wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a scattering of straw. Above the door, Paige left a few sacks of oats and some old tools, so that anyone glancing into the barn would see nothing but a cluttered storage corner. What made the room unusual was that Paige never intended to rely on a large fire. An open flame in a sealed underground space was dangerous, capable of stealing the air a person needed to breathe, and her father's notebook warned against it in blunt, underlined words. Instead, she relied on stored heat, warm stones, dry straw, her own body warmth, and the residual heat drifting down from the 2 aging horses stabled above. Those horses would never make the room hot, but their presence made the air inside the barn noticeably less brutal than the open winter outside. She also dug a narrow secondary exit toward the back of the barn, concealed beneath a wooden barrel and packed snow, a detail Dean Mercer never noticed during his inspection. That hidden exit would prove far more important than anyone, including Paige herself, expected once the real storm arrived. She tested the room's air quality the way her father had taught her, long before she understood why it mattered, by keeping a small candle burning near the entrance for short stretches and watching how steadily its flame behaved. A flame that guttered or leaned told her the air was moving wrong, and a flame that burned weak and low told her the room needed fresh air before anything else was done. She adjusted the vents again and again over several days, never satisfied until the little flame burned clean and upright for a full quarter-hour without wavering. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that produced no dramatic result anyone passing by could admire, only the quiet, invisible safety of air that would not slowly steal the breath from her lungs while she slept. Paige tried sleeping in the hidden room for the first time on an early, cold night, and at first the results seemed to prove her right. The room felt warmer than the cabin above, and the wind barely reached her at all through the packed earth and straw. But by early morning she noticed moisture beading along the clay walls, and the straw in one corner of the room had started to grow damp under her hands. The smell of the barn, already unpleasant to strangers, seemed thicker and heavier down in that enclosed space than she had anticipated. The next morning, Dean Mercer saw Paige carrying the damp straw outside to dry, and laughed loudly at the sight. He told anyone nearby that her little room was rotting before winter had even properly begun. Warren Pike, delighted by the news, announced that Paige would come crawling out of her stable grave before Christmas arrived, a line he repeated so often that even people who had never seen the barn began quoting it back to him for a laugh. The setback stung Paige more than she let anyone see, but it also taught her exactly what had gone wrong. The room had not been ventilated well enough. The lower air vent had been placed facing the wrong direction, and the straw touching the clay wall directly had been pulling cold moisture straight out of the earth. She did not waste time feeling sorry for herself. She went back to her father's notebook, reread the same pages twice, and began correcting her mistakes one at a time with the same stubborn patience she had shown from the beginning. She lined the walls with old burlap sacks, creating a gap between the straw and the clay so moisture could no longer travel directly into her bedding. She laid a thin bed of small stones along the base of the wall so any condensation would settle downward instead of soaking upward. She reshaped the air vents, adding sliding covers that let her control the airflow more precisely, and she hung a thin strip of cloth near the vent, simply to watch whether the air inside the room was actually moving. Every fix came from careful observation rather than guesswork, the same discipline her father had written about years before she was old enough to understand it. Naomi Vale brought over some cooled charcoal one afternoon and suggested Paige place it inside a tin container to help draw moisture from the air, a trick she had heard from an old trapper who once ate at her table. Paige tried it and found that it worked better than she expected, a small success that quietly deepened the bond between the two women. On her second night, testing the room, it felt drier. The smell had softened considerably, and the temperature held steadier through the coldest hours before dawn. Paige wrote a single line into her father's notebook that night, one that captured exactly where she stood. "Not as warm as a rich man's house," she wrote, "but warm enough to live." December arrived with strange signs that unsettled even the older residents of Alder Creek. The northern wind began blowing earlier than usual that year, and the horses across the valley started standing with their backs turned toward the mountain gap, an instinct old-timers rarely ignored. Alder Creek itself froze over in sections where the current usually ran too fast to ice before Christmas, something almost nobody in town could remember happening before. The oldest residents muttered that the coming winter carried a metallic smell in the air, an old superstition that nonetheless made several people uneasy. Paige recorded every sign she noticed in her father's notebook: the thickness of the ice each morning, the direction smoke traveled from chimneys, the sound of wood cracking in the cold, the depth of snow gathering along the fence lines. She began to understand that the coming storm would not simply bring cold. It would bring wind strong enough to bury doors, choke chimneys, and trap people inside their own homes without any warning until it was already too late to prepare. That realization frightened her more than any insult Dean Mercer or Warren Pike had thrown at her all autumn. She walked into town to warn people, urging them to bring their firewood inside, seal every gap in their doors, build a second way out of their homes, and never let their only source of survival sit outside where the storm could bury it. Dean Mercer mocked her outside the store, saying that a woman who slept beneath a horse barn had no right to lecture the people of Alder Creek about how to live inside a proper house. Warren Pike bragged about his double walls, his large stove, his private woodshed, and the hired hands who kept everything running smoothly around his property. He told anyone listening that if a storm came, money and good lumber would win in the end, a claim he made with the easy confidence of a man who had never truly gone hungry or truly gone cold. Sheriff Travis Rowan did not mock Paige, but he did not act on her warning either. Privately, he assumed she was still grieving her father's death and letting that grief shape her fears about the winter ahead, a kinder judgment than the others made, but one that still left her warning unheeded. Naomi Vale, however, listened carefully to everything Paige said, and quietly moved extra firewood behind her kitchen, sealed her back door, and stocked blankets and lamp oil inside her storage room where the weather could not reach them. That single decision, made without fanfare or public announcement, would end up being the reason Naomi survived what came next in far better condition than most of her neighbors. Paige's warning may have been dismissed by the loudest voices in Alder Creek, but it had planted a seed in at least one household that would not go to waste. The valley did not know it yet, but the coming days would sort its people into two groups with brutal clarity, those who had listened and those who had laughed. Paige also spent those final days before the storm reinforcing the trapdoor above her hidden room, packing extra straw around its edges and testing the rope line strung between the cabin and the barn until she was certain it would hold even under the weight of drifting snow. She filled every spare container she owned with water, knowing the creek would likely freeze solid within hours of the storm's arrival, and she moved what little dried food she had left down into the room itself, rather than trusting it to survive in the cabin above. None of this preparation looked impressive to anyone watching from a distance, and no one was watching closely enough to notice it anyway. But each small task she completed in those final days was one less thing that could fail her once the wind finally came. The storm arrived on the first night of January. At first it was only heavy snow falling silently, the kind of snowfall that made the valley look almost peaceful under the moonlight. But by midnight, the northern wind came roaring down through the mountain gap like a freight train, and the snow stopped falling gently from above and began flying sideways instead, striking wooden walls with the force of thrown gravel. Anyone who had lived through an Alder Creek winter before knew immediately that this storm was different from anything that had come in recent memory. Inside Paige's cabin, the door shook violently against its frame, and smoke from the stove began being forced backward into the room by the pressure of the wind outside. The fire flickered wildly and then partially went out, leaving the room colder within minutes than it had been all season. Snow piled against the front door so quickly that Paige could barely push it open more than the width of her own hand, and even that small gap let in a blast of cold air that stung her face like needles. This was exactly what she had feared from the beginning. Not that the cabin would collapse outright, but that it would slowly become a frozen box. The wind stole her fire, the snow buried her door, and the smoke pushed backward into the very room meant to keep her warm and alive. She wrapped a cloth over her face, grabbed the small emergency bag she had prepared weeks earlier filled with dry matches, an oil lamp, a wool blanket, her father's notebook, a knife, and dried bread, and moved quickly toward the narrow passage connecting the cabin to the barn. She used a length of rope she had strung earlier between the two buildings specifically for this moment, so she would not lose her way in the blinding, wind-driven snow. Inside the barn, her two old horses stood frightened but steady on their feet, and Paige took a moment to calm them and check their water before turning toward the trapdoor hidden beneath the straw. The hidden room welcomed her with the smell of earth, dry straw, and low, steady warmth. It was not comfortable, and it was certainly not beautiful, but it had one quality that mattered more than either of those things that night. There was no wind. She climbed down, closed the trapdoor above her, slid the wooden latch into place, and listened as the roar of the storm faded into a distant, muffled growl somewhere far above her head. For the first time in weeks, Paige allowed herself to believe that the room everyone had mocked might actually hold. She sat quietly in the dark for a long while, listening to her own breathing and the faint shifting of the horses overhead, waiting to see if the ground beneath Alder Creek would truly protect her, the way her father's notebook had promised. The storm continued into a second day, and then a third, until Alder Creek nearly disappeared beneath the snow entirely. Temperatures dropped further than anyone could remember. Chimneys across town became clogged with ice and debris, and many front doors were pressed shut so tightly by drifted snow that they simply would not open. Even families with large stoves found themselves in danger whenever smoke was forced backward by shifting wind, or whenever their firewood sat just outside their reach in sheds they could no longer walk to safely. Inside Paige's hidden room, conditions remained remarkably different from everything happening above ground. The low ceiling helped trap what little warmth existed, and although the surrounding earth was not exactly warm, it stayed far more stable than the freezing air outside. The stones she had heated before the storm continued, releasing warmth for many hours at a time. The dry straw kept her bed insulated from the cold ground beneath it, and the two horses stabled above created a buffer of slightly warmer air that kept the barn's interior from matching the brutal temperature outside. Paige survived by rationing every scrap of warmth she had. She avoided lighting any large fire, used her oil lamp as sparingly as possible, and opened her air vents only in short, careful bursts so the room's air could refresh without losing its hard-won heat. She recorded every shift in wind direction in her father's notebook, filling page after page with small, careful observations, partly out of habit and partly because writing gave her something steady to hold on to in the dark. Meanwhile, across town, conditions grew far more desperate with each passing hour. Dean Mercer's house began filling with smoke as his chimney froze partially shut, choking the air inside his own home. Cole Brantley's store grew bitterly cold after snow sealed his back door completely, leaving him huddled near a dying stove with dwindling fuel. Warren Pike found himself trapped inside his own main house, his large woodshed, sitting only a short distance away, yet completely unreachable through the wall of snow and wind separating him from it. All that money and good lumber he had bragged about counted for very little once the storm made simple movement impossible. Naomi Vale held on far better than most, thanks to the firewood she had quietly moved indoors weeks earlier after listening to Paige's warning. Her small eating house soon became a refuge for a few older neighbors seeking shelter, though even there, food supplies began running dangerously low as the days stretched on. By the third night, Sheriff Travis Rowan forced himself out into the storm to check on residents, driven by a growing sense that people were dying quietly behind doors nobody could open from either side. He found Dean Mercer nearly unconscious from smoke and cold, slumped near his blocked chimney with barely enough strength left to speak. In a voice barely above a whisper, Dean said something he never imagined himself saying aloud. "Paige's room beneath the barn," he murmured, "might still be alive down there." It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was the first honest thing Dean Mercer had said about Paige Callahan since the day he first mocked her for digging in the dirt beneath her father's horses. By then, Alder Creek had grown eerily quiet in a way none of its residents had ever experienced. The usual sounds of a working town replaced by nothing but wind and the occasional groan of a roof struggling under the weight of accumulated snow. No smoke rose from several chimneys at all, and those that did release smoke often released it in thin, sputtering trails that spoke of dying fires and dwindling fuel. Somewhere beneath the frozen surface of the valley, in the low room Paige had built with her own 2 hands. A woman once mocked for choosing dirt over dignity sat quietly rationing warmth, unaware that her name had already begun changing meaning in the mouths of the very people who once used it as an insult. Sheriff Travis Rowan, Naomi Vale, and a weakened Dean Mercer made their way toward Paige's barn, following the line of a fence that was nearly buried entirely beneath drifted snow, the wind so sharp it felt like it was cutting directly into exposed skin. Dean could barely walk on his own, stumbling more than stepping, and it was Naomi who led the way, remembering that Paige had once strung a rope between her cabin and the barn for exactly this kind of emergency. Without that memory, they might never have found the barn at all, through the near-total whiteness surrounding them. When they finally reached the property, Paige's cabin was almost completely swallowed by snow, its front door impossible to open from either side. But the barn still offered a partially sheltered entrance on its leeward side, protected just enough from the direct force of the wind. The sheriff knocked hard against the barn floorboards, and for a long, tense moment there was no answer at all. Then, slowly, the trapdoor hidden beneath the straw began to lift open from below. Paige emerged from underground, her face tired but alert, an oil lamp held steady in one hand. Dean Mercer looked down into the room he had once mockingly named the stable grave, watching a thin, gentle warmth rise up from below. It was not much heat by any ordinary measure, but to 3 people who had spent hours fighting through freezing wind, it felt almost like standing before an open fire. To enter, Dean had to bend low and climb down through a narrow, awkward opening, one careful step at a time. That detail mattered more than anything else happening in that moment. A man who had once stood above the hole in the ground, laughing at Paige, now had to lower his head and climb down into it simply to survive. Paige did not scold him, and she did not gloat over the reversal either. She handed him a blanket without a word, told Naomi to sit near the driest corner of the room, and asked the sheriff to seal the trapdoor quickly behind them, so the hard-earned heat would not escape into the freezing air above. For a long moment, nobody spoke at all, the four of them crowded into a space barely large enough to hold them, listening to the storm rage somewhere far above their heads, while the small warmed stones glowed faintly in the dark. Sheriff Travis Rowan finally broke the silence, asking Paige in a low voice how long she believed the room could keep the four of them alive if the storm refused to end. She answered honestly, telling him she did not know for certain, only that it had already outlasted every prediction Dean Mercer had made about it months earlier. Dean, wrapped in his blanket with his back against the packed earth wall, said nothing in response, though something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what she meant without needing it explained further. She checked Dean's breathing carefully, adjusted the air vent slightly to bring in a little fresh air, and placed one of her remaining warm stones close to his feet. Not long after, Warren Pike was brought to the barn as well, suffering from severe cold after collapsing in the snow while trying to reach his own woodshed. When he realized he was being lowered down into the very room beneath a horse barn he had once mocked without mercy, the color drained from his face, and it was not entirely from the cold. He said quietly, almost to himself, that he had once believed this place would kill her. Paige answered him simply, without anger and without pride in her voice. "No," she told him. "It only kills the wind before the wind can reach me." It was the emotional center of everything that had happened that winter, spoken not as revenge, but as plain fact from a woman who had simply refused to stop building, refused to stop learning, and refused to let ridicule decide whether she lived or died. After several more days, the storm finally passed, and sunlight returned to Alder Creek, though the valley looked like an entirely different place than it had before the blizzard struck. Many cabins had been damaged beyond simple repair. Several barns had collapsed under the weight of snow and wind. Livestock had frozen in the fields. Windows across town lay shattered, and firewood sheds sat buried under drifts taller than a grown man. The cost of the storm was visible everywhere a person looked, written plainly across the ruined shape of the valley. Paige's old barn still stood, weathered and far from perfect, but sturdy enough to shelter the hidden room beneath it, the same room that had kept several people alive through the worst nights of that winter. Word of what happened spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, carried by people who had seen it with their own eyes and repeated it to anyone who would listen. Nobody called it the stable grave anymore. Naomi Vale began referring to it as the Callahan Winter Room, a name that spread almost as fast as the old mocking one once had, though this time it traveled with respect instead of ridicule. Sheriff Travis Rowan asked Paige to teach other residents how to dig their own low shelters, how to place air vents correctly, how to keep straw dry, how to store heated stones, and how to prepare a secondary way out in case the main entrance became blocked. Dean Mercer, the man who had laughed loudest and longest at her expense, now stood quietly taking notes, no longer insisting that a proper house had to be tall, bright, and beautiful to be worth living in. Warren Pike sent lumber, stone, and burlap sacks to Paige's property as a kind of quiet apology, and she accepted part of it, insisting the rest be shared among the poorer families living at the edges of the valley who needed it far more than she did. When spring finally arrived, Paige opened the hidden room to let it air out and dry beneath the returning sunlight. Light poured down into the space once mocked as a grave, revealing nothing extraordinary inside it at all, only packed earth, dry straw, a scattering of stones, some old wooden boards, and the quiet memory of a father who had never lived to see his unfinished plan completed by his daughter. From that year onward, many of the horse barns scattered across Alder Creek began to include a low room built beneath their floors, not as a place to hide from shame, but as a place to survive when winter returned with its full, merciless strength. They once mocked her for sleeping beneath a horse barn, but when the whole valley froze solid around them, it was that lowest, humblest room in Alder Creek that kept the fire of life quietly burning beneath the snow.